This lecture series was established by Jennifer's late husband, Terry O'Reilly, and this is the first since his passing last year. The series is supported by the School of History and organised by Jennifer's past students, Maureen McCarran, Mal Gorzata, Krasnodebska, Doughton, and especially Diarmaid Scully. Jennifer's scholarship was and is strongly comparative, and in that sense, both her work and the work of today's speaker are very complementary. So what I have to say about Jennifer could equally well serve as an introduction to Professor Brown's talk. One day, a long time ago, Jennifer and I were consoling each other about yet another missed deadline. And it was an important one because it was for a subsidiary volume in the journal Romano Barbarica, edited by Professor Emerita Carrigoin, who I'm delighted to see here today, with whom Jennifer worked so closely and productively throughout her career. In the articles published, Romano Barbarica put down a marker in showing the deep debt that the culture of the Middle Ages owed to the classical past. Jennifer said that she felt that was very much the theme of her academic work, showing how the peoples of the islands of Ireland and Britain engaged with the learning of late antiquity in forming and expressing their own identities. That creative engagement with the Mediterranean civilization by insular writers and bookmakers is a significant focus of the work of today's speaker, who has shown the debt of the peoples of the Isles, the insular peoples, to the learning of late antiquity, and also their highly creative and imaginative responses to it. Michelle Brown has shown, like Jennifer, that the word insular in its medieval setting means precisely the opposite of to today's use of the word. As the foremost authority on insular book production and book culture, Professor Brown, who was curator of illuminated manuscripts in the British Library and professor of medieval manuscript studies at the University of London, has published extensively, and I know that sort of extensively is a term everybody throws in when they're introducing a speaker. I can say with absolute conviction, this is someone who has published extensively on the major and also the not so major insular codexes, and on the societies and cultures that produce them. On behalf of all here, I would like to welcome Professor Brown and thank her for honouring Jennifer's memory by delivering the Jennifer O'Reilly Memorial Lecture for 2024.
Thank you, Damian. Well, thank you all very, very much for turning up, and thank you all around the world online for whatever time it is of day or night. Bede is there somewhere counting the minutes, the seconds, and the pull of the moon. It's a bittersweet thing to be here today, isn't it? With Terry's memorial service, which was very beautiful, and for me to be able to have the privilege to get to know the O'Reilly boys, legends that they are, and also to hook up with a lot of people that I haven't been able to see for an awfully long time. So many, many blessings, and looking at all those lovely faces of people I've not met yet, and we're going to have a glass of wine afterwards. It doesn't get any better. So thank you, Terry, thank you, Jennifer, thank you, O'Reilly boys, thank you. Now, this paper is offered as a tribute to both Jenny and Terry O'Reilly, whose scholarship and joint lives of witness range from the spirituality and theology of Bede and Avignon to that of St. John of the Cross and St. Ignatius, and who shared a great sensitivity and insight into the significance of teaching as a mode of service and as a way of aiding the journeys of others. As Terry wrote in his moving translation of the wisdom sayings of St. John of the Cross, "O God, my delight, for love of you, my soul has chosen to be busied also with these sayings of light and love of you. For though possessing words for them, I lack their deeds and virtue, which please you more, my Lord, than their expression and wisdom, it may be that others, prompted by them, will make progress in your service and love in which I am wanting. and my soul be consoled that it has served as the means of you finding in others what it lacks in itself. You, Lord, love discretion. You love light. You love love more than the other operations of the soul. These sayings, therefore, will provide discretion for the journey, light for the road journeyed, and love in the journeying. Now, to my mind, Jenny and Terry thought and wrote on the good in order to contribute to the good. In choosing to study the works of some of the great spiritual and theological thinkers of the past, they too made their exegetical contributions to those ongoing branches of thought, as well as to history, art history, and literary studies. Their shared vocation reminds me somewhat of that of Bede, who wrote, "My chief delight has always been in study, teaching, and writing," in the autobiographical note with which he concluded his most famous work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731, according to the unified dating system from the birth of Christ, which he helped to promote and establish in popular use in the West. Now, Bede, of course, was Anglo-Saxon, born in Northumbria in 672-3 and dying there in 735, having lived as a priest and monk, ultimately, of the Northumbrian twin monastery of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow from the age of 7. But just think, we can't go into it too much here, but think about that first 7 years, Bede listening to the noises of the night in the shared communal hall, the sights and sounds of the farmyard, entering a monastery where the Mies van der Rohe buildings of their day were being explored, putting his fingers into the mortar. What's this? How does that work? The physical world, an inquiring mind that's into everything, getting under everybody's feet. Let's start with that picture of Bede, shall we? And my mind, it never goes away. His thinking, however, was shaped by that of the biblical authors, the patristics, certain classical and early medieval authors, and the learning of the early Irish church. In the face of the losses of much classical learning and the limited nature of existing scientific and historical research and methodology, Bede sought rigorously to reconcile tradition and innovation and to test his sources. His studies embraced diverse areas in pursuit of an understanding of what I would consider to be the cosmic logos. Call it God, call it the universe. I think cosmic logos in this context kind of works, as played out through the workings of the natural world and human history. For Bede, it's the why as well as the how as well as the why. We know this, I know, but for those who may not, he wrote on the nature of things, building on the encyclopedic natural history of Pliny and Isidore of Seville, wrote works on time and the calculation of time that Darwin knows better than anybody how they work. And Bede knew the configuration of the solar system. Even like all until Copernicus, he thought it all revolved around us instead of the sun. And his work on lunar observation, perhaps inspired by his readings on the military ballistics of Vegetius and others of antiquity, and his lunar calculations in connection with computistics, led him to think about gravitational pull of the moon and to construct the first tide timetables, thereby making a crucial practical contribution to a maritime people. Couple this with a fine Latin literary style, a love of poetry and of song, and a pioneering attitude towards the written vernacular, and you've got not only the father of English history, a committed transmitter and liver of the word, a creative scientific thinker and a deep thinking exegete and hagiographer, but also a pioneer of the English language and a rare authorial desktop publisher. Also something, I think, of a radical reformer, especially the older and more cantankerous he got, concerned at the abuse of power in both church and state, and an admirer and advocate of the service and asceticism of the Desert Fathers, especially as interpreted by their Irish equivalents and their followers in the watery wildernesses of the Northwest, and particularly Saints Aidan and Cuthbert at Lindisfarne. The Historia Ecclesiastica at one level seeks to situate the experience of the Anglo-Saxons and some of their neighbours in the ongoing traditions of Eusebius's universal ecclesiastical history. It was one of some 33 works that Bede lists in his autobiographical CV, and some 40 works are securely attributed to him from the total of 60 that scholars have accreted to him. Now that's prolific. Bede's research and his direct observation of the natural world and of human history had to be reconciled with scriptural revelation and learning inherited piecemeal from the ancients and patristics. He therefore devoted most of his research to producing some 20 works of biblical exegesis, excavating not only for literal meaning, as if excavating Sutton Hoo, but in rabbinic fashion, extracting multiple layers of allegorical interpretation through which deeper meaning might be discerned. And I've been forgetting to do the slides. Have a look at some pictures. Jenny and Terry. Weymouth Jarrow, you'll know about those. And the Velocity and Apocalypse and the Maya Star in one of the Chalfith Bibles, the sort of imagery that would have adorned the walls of the churches of Weymouth Jarrow, in which Bede recounts in the life of the abbots that Benedict Biscop and Chalfith brought back on the carts that trundled across the Alps. On one journey alone, they took 84 people with them. You can imagine the things that came back on those 6 trips to stop one of the greatest libraries of the post-Roman world and to decorate its churches. And this is a copy of the De Temporum. It's a 12th century copy, English copy, at the time when the scholastics are actually adding diagrammatic materials to supplement some of the early medieval things. This is Bede's rapid reckoner decimal system, which also functions as monastic sign language as well. And Cuthbert, if only I could build a cell with walls so high that all I could see was the sky, I'd still be afraid. The love of wealth and the cares of the world would snatch me away. Hunger strike outside the walls of a king intent on genocide of his British neighbours and attacking Scottish and Irish rulers. And that will take us to the east. Right, you okay? Can I park you in the east for a minute, Branso? The historical ecclesiastical one, okay, this one. Bede's research and his direct observations of the natural world and human history had to be reconciled with scriptural revelation and learning, as we've said. These multiple layers are amongst the most nuanced, multivalent of early Christian commentaries, citing his own people in a perpetual biblical landscape. His Locis Sanctis, working upon work perhaps by Arculf and certainly by Avignon, but with his own biblical and other research materials, extended his temporal vision eastwards and remained one of the most reliable guidebooks for travellers throughout the Middle Ages, and is even known to have been used by travellers in the early 20th century. Now, it's quite something to let your imagination and your research write something that could be practically used when the farthest we think you ever travelled was about 65 miles. From home. But the journey of the imagination, the intellect, the adventure of this, and the deep learning in which it was based just is amazing. And of course, it was on Lindisfarne where he struck up a relationship with Bishop Eadfrith, which would lead to the construction of the fully developed cult of St. Cuthbert, on whom he composed both prose and verse lives, and the making of the Lindisfarne Gospels, a process in which I would suggest Bede exerted a direct, if remote, influence. Bede's mindset is characterised by joined-up thinking and the long view. That's why I choose to work on him. I think we haven't really got quite enough of those today, which extended across time and space and occasionally transcended it to glimpse the fourth dimensions of eternity and the reconciliation and unification of creation underpinned by Logos, the eternal creative word, which I think shapes and guides his interaction with the world of learning and scripture. And there we have the cult of St. Cuthbert. Basically, I've argued that the coffin of Cuthbert, etc., is very much in line with the creation of Coptic bishops' cults of the 6th and early 7th centuries. You basically got a late Coptic style painted sarcophagus with Isis and Horus, etc., replaced by the Virgin and Child, and of course the little Coptic bound Gospel of John, the Cuthbert Gospels within. Okay, what And I really just put that up to contrast the approach of cult books of the period with the sort of Codex Purpureus, stained purple, written in gold and silver scripts that Wilfrid and his followers favoured as the focal point of his cult in Ripon after his death around 709, and that adopted at Lindisfarne in the Lindisfarne Gospels as the great shrine book of St Cuthbert, where the contributions of the peoples of the Northwest join those of continental Europe and the Northeast in presenting a smorgasbord fusion cooking landscape of how those people sit in an ongoing and an historic matrix visually. Ezra, where are you? Oh yeah. And if you're, I will say later, if you're going to envision this sort of process as we do now in the digital age, if you're not going to use something like the Hadron Collider, then I would suggest that a carpet page on the Lindisfarne Gospels or one of the pages in Kells can pretty much get you to the same point of embarkation, if not rival. Okay. In response to a letter from Bishop Hacker of Hexham, his alleged sponsor, Bede writes concerning his commentary on Luke, I have subjected myself to that burden of work, in which, as in innumerable bonds of monastic servitude, which I shall pass over, I was myself at once author, dictator, notary, and scribe. Now, this distinction reveals that he regarded such work as opus Dei and differentiated between his functions as an author, who of course would usually dictate rather than pick up the penna and write themselves, as his own secretary, his own note taker and copyist, but also as a scribe, as a scribal evangelist. The 6th century monastic founder and publisher Cassiodorus had written that in those who translate, expand, or humbly copy scripture, the Spirit continues to work, as in the biblical authors. Bede elaborates this theme in relation to Ezra the scribe, who fulfilled the law by rewriting its destroyed books and opened his mouth to interpret scripture and teach others. This conceptualization of the act of writing is presented as an essential personal act for the scribe, preacher, teacher, a combined function which Bede presents and of which he was an exponent himself. Bede's role as a scribe of scripture, the Christian equivalent of the Jewish sofer, which was of course a priestly calling, scribes and Pharisees, etc., would surely have led to his scholarly physical contribution to the production of the great Chelfrith Bibles. I really can't see, I know it's perhaps a maybe and circumstantial, but placing so much emphasis on I am a scribe, which is separate from being a copyist, which is separate from being a dictator and author, that he would not actually have wanted to play not only an editorial and a scholarly role in that process of creating the Chelfrith Bibles, but that he would have claimed the honour in his humility of being one of the sofers himself. But I can't prove it. Nobody can prove it. Oh, yeah, we haven't got the smoking quill. And of course, the Chelfrith Bibles perpetuate the publishing legacy of late antiquity, mediated via the models of Eusebius, Jerome, Cassiodorus, and the Vivarium. This would in turn shape the Carolingian biblical publishing endeavours of Alcuin of York and the Tours Scriptorium, resulting in an edition that would form the basis of the medieval university syllabus and which fed into the creation of the first printed editions of the Bible. Bede's contribution to this process forms the core of this paper. 2001 saw the appearance of one of Jenny's many seminal papers, the Library of Scripture, Views from Vivarium and Wearmouth Jarrow, reprinted in 2019 in volume 2 of Jenny's collected papers, to which we owe great thanks to Carol Farr, Elizabeth Mullins and Tom O'Reilly in particular, and all those who contribute. In it, Jenny discussed the relationship between the approaches of Cassiodorus's monastery of the Vivarium, established on his estate in southern Italy in the 6th century, and that of the twin monastery of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, founded by Biscop in late 7th century Northumbria. It made a major contribution to a strand of scholarship already spun by scholars such as Rupert Bruce Mitford, Per Jonas Nordhagen, Karen Corsano, Paul Mither, Carol Farr, George Henderson and Richard Marsden. So many great contributions. And for many of these authors, the Ezra miniature in Amiatinus was an important focal point for considering these relationships and serves as our point of entry. The key to reading such complex imagery as we have here, which isn't obviously just a figural narrative, especially during the Insular period, lay in the principle of multivalence. Why settle for only one literal meaning when you can simultaneously explore other deeper levels of allegorical meaning? You can't know what an onion is by looking at an onion. You've got to peel an onion. You've got to peel away layer after layer to really get your eyes watering. And then you've got to bite into an onion and cook with an onion and make a poultice out of an onion. And then you might know what an onion is. And then you can work out what it might represent and signify. The relentless rational pursuit of literal meaning espoused by the scholastics during the 12th century was yet to come. John Cassian, and of course, remember mine, Benedict Biscop had studied at Lorraine, as had Patrick, with Cassian's influence pervading the teaching there. A founding figure of Eastern and Western monasticism had advocated the deployment of three sorts of spiritual knowledge in order to understand scripture: allegory, anagogue, and tropology. History deals with real past events which had a literal meaning, whereas allegory relates to prefigured mysteries. Anagogue goes beyond such mysteries to penetrate the very secrets of heaven, whilst tropology interprets all three for moral instruction in the present. Now, this was perhaps related to the Jewish Kabbalistic concept of Pardes, the orchard or paradise garden, and Bede's approach was, this approach was also favoured by Jerome and Gregory before Bede, and he deploys it very well in his works on rhetoric, De Schematibus et Tropis. And such lay of meaning might be difficult to read to other than learned scholars, but the taste for riddles and conundrums in the age probably inclined people towards it. And of course, art renders it more accessible. And Bede's writings, of course, abound with verbal iconographic visualizations. That's Amiatinus, of course. God, it's a building, not a book, isn't it? It's a library. And what books do you have on your library shelves? And what editions of those books do you have? Kells, where have you gone? Kells. Oh, well, we all know what Kells looks like, don't we? We've all been to the experience, the Kells experience. Excellent. Okay, can you summon up in your imagination for me the temple and the temptation in Kells? It'll come up at some point. An example of how Bede deployed such tools occurred in his allegory on the temple in the figures of rhetoric. Quote, in the literal sense, the temple is the house which Solomon built. Allegorically, it's the Lord's body, of which Christ said, destroy the temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. Or his church, to which the Apostle Paul said, for the temple of the Lord is holy, which you are. Tropologically, it is each of the faithful to whom the apostle said, know you not that your bodies are the temple of the Spirit who is in you? Anagogically, it is the joys of the heavenly mansion for which the psalmist sighed when he said, blessed are they that dwell in your house. They will praise you forever. Now, I wonder whether at one level, the miniature of the temptation of Christ in the Book of Kells, which Carol and Jennifer and others have written so wonderfully about, does have a measure of the same way in which Bede, it's one of the layers of meaning and understanding, perhaps. So Bede deploys mental images of a pictorial nature in his text and was no doubt also instrumental in contributing to the formulation of the use of visual images at Wearmouth, Jarrow and beyond. He plucked all the flowers from the rabbinical garden of Pardes to help him read and interpret intelligently and sensitively. He fully imbibed Gregory the Great's injunction that internalization of exterior details brings the reader towards a transformation of earthly behavior and thought into an anticipation of heavenly counterparts. Numerology and verbal and visual iconographies are also frequently used to this end. There we go. My only apology for this is I've had Legionella for nearly 5 months and I'm kind of a bit... So yeah, there we go. You see what I mean about temple, body. Okay. Catherine Sinai, Justinian's 6th century basilica. Another example is when he writes in his commentary on Acts in chapter 20, where Paul is teaching in a lamplit upper room, where Bede says, "We can speak allegorically here, for the upper room is the loftiness of spiritual gifts. Night is the obscurity of the scriptures. The abundance of lamps is the explanation of the more enigmatic sayings." My thesis here being that some of the Weymouth Jarrow complex multivalent iconographies have got Bede's hand in them, as well as his visual and verbal imagination. Now, for the peoples of 6th and 7th century Britain and Ireland, brought up on centuries of a rich diet of storytelling, vibrant imagination and learning, and an art of personal adornment replete with encoded symbols and ornament, we would have had a receptive audience for the sort of imagery associated with the spoken and written word and used in preaching and exegesis in this way. Exploitation of visual memory would have assisted those introducing them to a new Christian cultural narrative and a new way of thinking and living. Appreciation of the semiotic potential of motifs and symbols was inherent within pre-Christian Celtic and Germanic art and merged with Christian symbolism to great effect. For if letters were the email and social media equivalents of their day, then the great illuminated manuscripts and carved monuments were the movies. Then as now, you didn't need to be able to understand they or their nuances completely in order to participate in the community of reading that they stimulated. For the visual literacy of the early Middle Ages is characterised to a certain extent by the interaction of words to be seen and images to be read. We're watching a black and white Truffaut movie, yeah? Boys are saying, "Not much action, is there? Where's the storyline?" Some of the girls are saying, "Oh, but think how the major protagonists echo Abelard and Eloise." And the gentleman at the back is saying, "Don't be ridiculous, it's all about Jean-Paul Sartre." Now, you can read it at all or any of those levels and they come and they go, but you have an access point. My point here with this slide, of course, is that if you take, for example, the Germanic statue animal ornament of the Sutton Hoo shoulder clasp, in which every animal looks like the love child of an elephant and a vacuum cleaner, they may be deeply imbued with symbolism and mythology, but with adding something like a recognisable cat, you're immediately able to pick something off of the shelves of your inner library of reference, even if you only ever heard it orally, and relate that ultimately through the physiologus to Pliny, and the cat being the threat of evil waiting to pounce on the unwary, and for a Celtic audience, Crutna, the guardian of the entrance to the other world. And so suddenly your little birds going along holding the tail feather of the one in front on Monday morning, heading straight for the mouth of the cat who swallowed a pleasing breakfast of 10 of them, gives you another level of access and reading of the ornament. These processes can, I would say, be seen in the Ezra miniature in Amiatinus, which I think should be read not only as an image of Cassiodorus, adapted to reference the great preserver of the Judaic scriptures, Ezra the scribe, but as a homage to the continued process of rediscovery and emendation of sacred texts, continually inspired by the spirit in which the Chelfrith Bibles played a significant role. The bookcase containing the 9 volumes, of course, simultaneously makes reference to Cassiodorus' work and one of his editions, the Novem Codices, the 9-volume edition, but labels them on the spine in an arrangement that doesn't accord with the clues that Cassiodorus gave us in his Institutiones, his institutes, his ground plan for his publishing system. Instead, the labelling makes reference to the work of other editors of scripture, such as Augustine. So the number 9 represents the Novem Codices, while the labelling indicates they were part of an ongoing, fluid, living tradition. That the image of Ezra is likely to have originated at Vivarium is reinforced by Cassiodorus' Institutiones, in which he gives lists of the sacred books and refers to an image of the tabernacle and to diagrams of the arrangements of biblical books, all of which are perpetuated in Amiatinus. But this, however, I would say is a significant adjustment to perceptions of the image, for it indicates that Cassiodorus and those responsible for the Chalfith Bibles were not attempting to provide an authorised edition, but an authoritative one, drawing on and improving upon the best sources they could find in order to carry forward the process of revelation and understanding. It would have been an anathema to them to view their work as the last word. The process of transmission and exploration was a divinely inspired one, which had to be perpetuated. And thus our figure of the scribe is simultaneously Ezra, the evangelist, Jerome, Augustine, Cassiodorus, Chalfith, Bede and their brethren, and anyone who cares to be involved in the ongoing transmission of the word. In 715, the final bastion of Columban tradition, Iona, conformed to Orthodox practices. Not Rome, Orthodox, I would prefer to say. And tellingly, within the year, Chalfith had departed for Rome, the westernmost of the Eastern Patriarchates, taking the Codex Amiatinus as the eloquent and monumental ambassador for the islands at the edge of the world and for the newly reconciled Insular Church, to present to his friend the newly appointed librarian Pope Gregory II, who had facilitated his own research requests earlier. As is well known, this remarkable tome was not recognised as English work until the late 19th century. So convincing is its Italo-Byzantine stylistic cloaking mechanism, with Gregorian-style uncials classicising painterly style redolent of the Syriac frescoes of Santa Maria Antica in the Forum, and a text which, along with the Gospels preserved in the Lindisfarne Gospels, is considered the best extant excavated and reconstructed witness to St. Jerome's editorial work on the Vulgate undertaking in Bethlehem in the 4th century. It represents a masterly work of scholarly reconstruction and editorship on the part of the Wearmouth Jarrow Scriptorium. Amiatinus proclaims the fulfilment of the apostolic mission. The word had been preached to the farthest ends of the then known earth, and the precondition for the second coming was fulfilled. Only now in these islands could such a feat of biblical transmission and scholarship have occurred, building on what was known physically or conceptually of Cassiodorus' library and his vision for biblical scholarship and publication. Now, Pope Agapetus I and Cassiodorus had planned a new library in Rome, a bit like Leyland going to Henry VIII in the aftermath of the dissolution, and Henry just sort of picking out the key things on music and divorce and letting everything else go. But anyway, and they planned, even in the wake of the barbarian ravages that were still continuing, and planned the decoration of the entrance hall. Always start with your entrance hall, yeah? It was to be adorned with mosaics depicting fictive bookcases like the Armarium in Amiatinus, representing fictive authors through their books, who were to be dispatched as long-distance teachers to the ends of the earth. Now, that scheme never came to pass, but some of those book teachers certainly did arrive and survived the wreckage of late antique and early Christian libraries in Italy, for sure. And at Wearmouth Jarrow, they found a particularly avid and receptive audience in Bede. Now, it is likely that, and of course, Galla Placidia, again, has that same motif of the evangelists in the form of their books encouraging St. Lawrence as he takes his own book to the barbecue to be martyred upon it. The anthropomorphization of books is an interesting thing, and the naming of books, the naming of swords. It's a very Armenian practice as well, an Eastern practice, which is an insular adoption, I think. So it's likely that Wearmouth Jarrow did actually include some remnants of the earlier Cassiodorian library that had probably been dissipated and were available in Rome at that time. The programme that he constructed at the Vivarium of religious life, which was dedicated to Lectio Divina, the studying, editing, accurate copying and the dissemination of scripture, really gives us the first post-Roman publishing drive with a new emphasis upon its meaning and the process of dissemination. But I think this was partly shaped by Emperor Constantine's request to his bishop Eusebius of Caesarea in 326-7 to produce 50 copies of the Bible for the imposing churches he was constructing. You can't put a scrofulous wax tablet or papyrus scroll on the high altar of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the ultimate focus of the word adequately. And on his deathbed, Skeat did actually finally say that he did believe that Codex Sinaiticus was one of the Eusebian Bibles. But what a thing to be asked to do, to be able to create fine codices and a stable, allegedly textual representative out of the plethora of materials that were available in the pre-Eusebian period is just quite remarkable. Now, Bede takes Eusebius as a bit of a hero figure, and the Historia Ecclesiastica at one level can be seen as an addendum to the universal ecclesiastical history of Eusebius, putting the peoples of the Northwest into that continuum. And in a way, I think that he may have been seeing his work as part of that editorial publishing, as an addendum to the Eusebian strand mediated through figures such as Cassiodorus. And Chalfrith likewise assumes this mantle when he devotes the human and bibliographical resources of Wearmouth Jarrow to perpetuating the initiative in producing the Chalfrith Bibles. His special son and scholarly jewel, Bede, would surely have played a leading role in producing the 3 great single-volume Bibles that he commissioned from the Wearmouth Jarrow Scriptorium. 2, of course, were to be retained for reference by Runk Wearmouth and Jarrow, where they could be used for refectory reading, etc., but also as exemplars for further copies, which is the strategy that Alcuin then adopts with the Turonian Bibles and their dissemination. The 3rd, of course, accompanies Chalfrith on his final journey to Rome in 716 as a gift for the Pope, and survives in Florence as Amiatinus. Fragments of others have resurfaced over the years, some discovered as binding fragments in a Newcastle junk shop by Canon Greenwell, and others in the country house estates, giving us the Middleton leaves and the Banks leaves from National Trust properties of the North. One is from the copy left for Monk Wearmouth and the other from Jarrow, which was, it seems, donated by King Offa later in the 8th century to Worcester, by which time, by the 780s, it was already thought to have been made in Rome, so Romanising was its style. Now, Eusebius, Church of the Sepulchre, Codex Sinaiticus, leaves from a Chalfrith Bible, spot the similarity. Okay, and these are the Middleton leaves. These are some of the National Trust document wrappers now in the British Library. And these are the 2 that Richard Marsden spoke about that I'm about to mention. Marsden has ascribed some corrections to King's 4 on these Middleton leaves to the hand of Bede or one of his students on textual grounds, and relates these to notes that occur on the opening diagrammatic quire with the Ezra miniature in Amiatinus. And he writes, it's quite possible that Bede had the emendations entered by an assistant, one of his pupils perhaps, yet it seems to me as least likely that he wrote them himself, and it may therefore be Bede's hand that we see in the emendation to 4 Kings on the Sister Pandect. And he goes on to write, it's plausible enough, nevertheless, to imagine Bede, whether or not he wrote the text in the diagrams himself, steadily amending the Chalfrith biblical texts during the 2nd and 3rd decades of the 8th century. His interest in textual criticism of the Bible is well established, as we've seen, and there's evidence enough that even in Amiatinus, which was available only until Chalfrith's departure in 716, deliberate emendations had already been made, surely under Bede's influence, if not by his own pen. So what do these actually look like? Well, the little word quasi that you see under the red ink later added paragraphus symbol is one of them, and the other is the quasi usque in the left hand margin, 3 lines from the top. Now you'll see it's not a lot to go on, and they're written slightly less formally. The ductus is more rapid letter forms, but that is consistent with the sort of annotation of late antiquity in the early Christian period, where you would use a slightly, because you're writing it quicker and less formally, it almost becomes another scriptural grade. If you choose to go along for half uncial, quarter uncial, cursive, half uncial in the way that Lowe did, yeah. So you've only really got those to go on, and the single and two-word annotations in some of the diagram pages. So it's hard to say whether it is Bede or whether it's his students, but it certainly is somebody who is engaging with that level of detail, that is going through that process. So I don't think that that precludes the suggestion in my recent book, Bede and the Theory of Everything, that there's another candidate for Bede's writing in Amiatinus, to which I'll return shortly. Nor does it preclude that these were Bede or one of his students, because they are annotations by hand, very, very similar, which I think was Bede's, and could be writing them slightly less formally. But there really isn't, to my mind, enough to go on to be able to really be conclusive about that. Now, we don't know for sure whether Weymouth Jarrow possessed a copy of the Institutiones. Karen Corsano said yes, Jenny thought not. In this particular work, he outlines the publishing programme and the rule of life governing the community, and praised the scholarship of Dionysius Exiguus, whose computistical work so influenced Bede, and wrote eloquently of the sacred role of the Scribe of Scripture. But whether they had it or not, Bede and his brethren certainly seem to have drunk deeply from its knowledge and many of the approaches expressed therein. And the Weymouth Jarrow Library is certainly known to have possessed several other Cassiodorian works, perhaps even from Vivarium itself, and also to have copied some of the works, such as the commentary on the Psalms in Durham Cathedral Library, Manuscript B230, which you see on the right-hand side there. And we'll return to this in a minute, but this is the handwriting that I think is a good candidate for Bede's hand, for reasons that I'll explain to you presently. So drink him in. Now, Jenny drew attention to the patristic concept of the inner library and the necessity for each believer to make him or herself an ark or library of the word, which Cumian the Wise of Iona referred to as entering the sanctuary of God through studying and transmitting scripture. Books fill the believer's inner library and are the enablers of direct contemporary action, channels of the spirit and gateways to enlightenment. She also suggested that Weymouth Jarrow was adapting material from Vivarium exemplars to produce the prefatory choir for the Chalfrith Bibles. And as Carol Farr, Eamon O'Carrigan and others have demonstrated, the concerns manifest in editing and illustration by means of complex sacred figurae, diagrammatic multivalent images that embody theological concepts, tie in with the preoccupations that Bede shows in his own commentaries written around the same time. I've also suggested recently that this programme was also drawn upon and strategically adapted further in the Lindisfarne Gospels around 715 to 22, and that Bede may have had a hand in this in collaboration with Bishop Eadfrith of Lindisfarne, to whom he dedicated his prose life of Cuthbert. Now, we haven't got so much time. I'm going to depart a little bit from the written text. You can read that later, about what were the different editions that Cassiodorus had and whether they were or weren't known. Some of us know that, and those that can't can read up about that later. But the varied textual affiliations of Amiatinus, which has in the absence of fuller evidence to be taken as representative of the other two lost Chalfrith Bibles, shows that rather than undertaking a direct copy, they're actually producing an uncharacteristic, ambitious, single-volume Bible, picking up on the idea of a single-volume Bible, the Codex Grandior from Cassiodorus, but not just copying it. They're creating it. And the idea here, I think, is that you do create a library. You create an authoritative version with certain versions of the different books upon its shelves, which then allow you to disseminate those to wider audiences for copying and emendation elsewhere. It's an active, dynamic work of scholarship, compilation, emendation, and of physical production at both the textual and the visual level. Okay, Bede for me is a key part of that. It's not the only one. Whitbert, his counterpart, who became the librarian in Rome after the abbot, who the Pope writes back to and says, "Thank you for this acceptable gift of Amiatinus. We can see you're more Roman than the Romans." Okay, he too was another of that ilk. Now, unusually, the Chalfrith Bible stressed the integral complementary nature of Old and New Testaments as a single monolith, as much building as book. And Chalfrith has, of course, styled in his dedication page as abbot from the ends of the earth, intending Amiatinus to proclaim to Rome his people's contribution to the apostolic mission. His embassy was also, of course, an apologia on behalf of the English for political problems and controversies surrounding the turbulent career of Archbishop Wilfrid of York. Now, many of the scribes mentioned in the Bible, of course, were priests entrusted with the preservation, interpretation and exposition of Scripture. And it's interesting that amongst his commentary, the new ground that Bede broke was to write on Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as on the temple and tabernacle, which are new strands of exegesis. And of course, the picture that evolves from his commentaries there, and which I think he adopted himself in his own use of the scribal and priestly function, is of course that Ezra and Nehemiah are not only the preservers and reinterpreters of Scripture for the New Age, but they are the voices to power. They are the voices individually to church in church abuse and to state in state abuse and abuses of bad government. And I think it's interesting that Bede seems to have been writing on those exegetical works and planning them at the same time in his research programme as he is, I would say, having a hand in the Chalfrith Bibles. They seem to be conceived as part of a joint approach. Now, of course, Bede is also very much concerned with the mechanics of text. He's very well versed in understanding composition and construction. And of course, his work as a grammarian and on Latin composition of verse become major teaching tools over subsequent centuries. His work on rhetoric and familiarity with schemes and tropes, again, essential when studying biblical contextualization and meaning subsequently. Graphic articulation of text and the mechanics of text are also of concern to him, with his works on orthography, for example, and uses of vocabulary, spelling, and the abbreviation systems used in classical Latin. So he's very much engaged with the mechanics of text in a way in which a thinking editorial author scribe would be. Etymology, another one of his great interests. Now, he works on both Old and New Testaments. Got an expert here on some of that, Emily in the audience. And he characterises as the law and the gospel. He's very into the Apocrypha, of course, and you also have the unbroken ground of Ezra and Nehemiah, the temple, the tabernacle, the Proverbs of Solomon, and on Tobias. So he's a biblical scholar and editor as well. Just as his commentaries on the temple and tabernacle present a symbolic reading of their construction and adornment as forerunners of the heavenly Jerusalem and serve as an injunction to the English to work for the coming of an eternal kingdom, so his interpretation of Ezra and Nehemiah emphasised the role of secular rulers and high priests, archbishops and bishops, such as Egbert of York, to whom Bede addresses a blistering letter calling for reforms of abuses in 8th century Northumbria, and his attempts to defend Lindisfarne in the face of Bishop Hacker of Hexham's attempts to phase out the distinctive Irish-influenced model of the Perugia of St. Columba and of St. Cuthbert. And it's Bede who steps into their defence in the last stages of his life. It will not have escaped notice that, reminding both kings and senior churchmen of their duties in this respect, it's Bede who's recasting himself in the role of the prophetic scholar, priest and doctor Ezra. Bede also wrote commentaries on the Gospels of Luke and Mark, the former composed between 709 to 16 and the latter following shortly after. And these are prefaced by letters showing that they were undertaken at the bequest of Bishop Acca of Hexham. And here in the letter accompanying Luke, Bede outlines his system of marginal annotations as sources and enjoined others to retain and use them when quoting, which is a truly scholarly and scribal perspective. It's here that we also find him refuting accusations of the dangerous heresy of innovation. In an earlier work, the Commentary of the Apocalypse, and this, of course, becomes the usual medieval interpretation of the ordering of the evangelist symbols. But it does cause an attack in which Bede is rather stunned to find that he is being accused of innovation because his detractors, who are part of the circle of Acca, basically are not so well read and don't know that he's quoting Gregory of Nazianzen, etc. So Bede basically gets his revenge by inventing footnotes. So thereafter you put the initials of your authorial source in the margins. He also around this time invents a practice of using a yellow magic marker. He develops little lightning flashes as a graphic device in the margins, which show you when he's quoting passages as well. So his graphic response to attacks upon his scholarship by those less lettered than himself can be traced in the practicalities of his work, as well as what he is writing in the commentary on Luke. Now, I think, had time permitted, he might have engaged in a commentary on Matthew, but it might also have been that he felt that Origen, Jerome, Augustine and Gregory had already gone there already and done a good enough job, and that it wasn't necessary. But as we know, he skips to the jump, and on his deathbed in 735, he's returning to the task, but this time not commenting on St. John, but taking the bold step of translating it into his native Old English, that it might be more readily accessible to his people. A last offering from the teacher, preacher and priest, along with clarifying certain problematic passages from Isidore. And of course, this process of the vernacular translations and commentaries is something that Jenny and her collaborators have made such an incredible contribution to allowing people to share this aspect of the Beden strategy today. John's Gospel, of course, is that used in ministering to the sick and the dying. It's a pastoral and spiritual visionary masterpiece that St. Cuthbert has spent formative time studying with his master Boisel at Melrose. And I think it's interesting that the Stonyhurst or Cuthbert Gospel is actually constructed codicilogically. Not only is it bound in a Coptic manner with a Coptic style of decorative binding as well as the unsupported sewing techniques, but it also has the same number of gatherings and choirs as those that Bede refers to in his prose life of Cuthbert. So the artifact, made obviously later, is emulating the hagiography. It's fulfilling the hagiographical connection in the same way that I've argued further now in the Book of Armagh is summoning up a lost Patrician proto book relic. Yeah. So it's amazing that last period of his life, when he's 62 and the health has really gone and he's working, sitting up, propped upright on his stone floor, that last 3 to 4 weeks, he's taking that step of the ultimate innovation. It's the first translation of any part of the biblical text into Old English, but it's also the first translation into a Western vernacular, i.e. a Latin alphabet oriented and inspired departure point rather than a Greek, etc. So it's a remarkable thing to do. Perhaps only on his deathbed did he dare do it, but it's quite an incredible trajectory. And of course, by that point, he's having to dictate rather than write. I'm going to skip some of this and just talk about it now because it's more interesting. Okay, right, let's do Bede's hand. Okay, this is a Bamberg 8th century copy of the Institutiones, which certainly is available on the continent and would have been available, one would have thought, to insular scholars, certainly from that route, if not actually here. Time for that. Temple, Amiatinus, right. Stonyhurst Gospel. I do think that the hand that I've said in my book that I think might be Bede, it is actually quite close to Stonyhurst, the Cuthbert Gospel. There's more work to be done on testing some of it. I don't think they're necessarily the same, but they're certainly the two closest hands out of the 7 in Amiatinus. The one that I think is Bede's. The closest non-Amiatinus example is the Cuthbert Gospel. And these are artifacts that were found relating to literacy from the little room in the Abbot's lodging in Jarrow, which it's thought may have been Bede's schoolroom, and where he may have spent his last hours. So those are actually Bede period prickers and styli, and a little portable altar. My arguments for why I think this is the hand of Bede are this. I'll find it. Okay, can't find it anyway. Okay, so basically we're here in the preface to the Book of Kings in Amiatinus, which again is an area that Bede was writing on actively at around the same time. You see, the hand that I found is actually working in areas of text that Bede was actually looking at in his exegetical commentary work at the same time. It's like he's very engaged in particular books, and it's those that I can find this hand active in. It's a very neat, compact little uncial, plenty of character and fluidity, and a willingness to depart from the canonical forms that you find in the other hands. The other hands in Amiatinus are very much to emulate in an almost antiquarian fashion the uncial that you get in the Rome of Gregory the Great. This particular hand is prepared to be more fluid. It introduces more letter forms, some of them from the sort of more minuscule and half uncial end of the spectrum, etc. But it's a very proficient, confident hand. He knows about the house style. He's working within it, but he's not slavishly emulating a particular antiquarian genre in quite the same way. And you find that also in the Cuthbert Gospel. He's very concerned with the comprehension and correct pronunciation of Greek and Hebrew terms. There are marginal reference annotations in this area and interlinear notes that are concerned with correct pronunciation, as I say, of Hebrew, personal place names, etc. You've also got in places Greek annotations in the margins that allow you to actually follow the structure of the text, and which serve in places as seen to one fois. Now, I don't think Bede is the only one that knows Greek, obviously, in the Wim of Scribe of Scriptorium, but this is exactly the same time that he is developing his system of using the marginal counter in order to be able to develop graphic annotation systems, such as the footnoting and the highlighting. And the highlighting is found in sections of the script by this hand, and so are Greek and Hebrew lettering annotations. So it does seem to me that the approach to how you articulate the text and its mechanics is something which is very Bedean. There may be others doing it, but we know that Bede was. So to my mind, that makes it a particularly good candidate, and the fact that there are areas of text that he is very much working on in his own personal study and commentaries and exegesis at the time. Another feature of this, and again, I hope you will take the time to read the paper when it comes out and to look at the book, because it is quite closely argued, is that when I did the Lindisfarne work in 2003, I argued at that time that I thought that in John's Gospel, in the Lindisfarne Gospels, that when Aldrig losses it in the 950s or thereabouts as part of his dowry coming into the Lindisfarne community at Chester Street, John's Gospel uses 2 inks. Okay, it's a compound gloss, I would argue, and I worked through and suggested that the use of red ink, which of course is often used elsewhere at this period to show a heightened importance of text, using purple or red ink is not only a rubrication thing, it can be a status thing as well. So I thought, well, could these bits of text be being singled out and highlighted and honoured by the use of red? And lo and behold, myself and others, Julia Fernandez-Cuesta and others have been analysing the text, and it does seem that those areas that have got the red have been singled out because they are not part of the main gloss. They've come from another source or sources, and the lexical and grammatical deployment of them, Fernandez-Cuesta and others in their work on the literary style of Bede's Old English would argue are Beden. Okay, so the contention is that Aldred, as part of his sources for the Old English gloss of what remains the earliest surviving translation of the Gospels into the English language, had got hold of what the Lindisfarne community saw as Bede's deathbed translation, or part of it, and that he had integrated it into his own rather pedantic, no, it's not quite the right word. Aldred constructs his own glosses in the manner of the schoolroom. So it's a word by word. If you print it out, it doesn't make a continuous literary text. It's sardine equals herring, you know. But the areas where you've got the red go into it in a far more literary style. But interestingly enough, they don't go into it in the way in which you would imagine. When the apostles are spoken about, it refers to them as thanes. And it refers to Thomas here, and that it's not the sort of thing where Aldred, who's painstakingly doing a word by word Latin to Old English or what in front of him. It's somebody who knows their stuff and is doing it from their memory, as one can imagine Bede might well have done. And then the thanes, you know, it's odd. And the language and the lexicography and the grammatical structure. Other scholars more adept at Old English than myself have agreed they see as Beden. So we may well have at least part of Bede's deathbed translation of John still preserved in the pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels, which I think for me gives a particularly nice symmetry to it. Of course, when Alcuin is headhunted by Charlemagne and is working in the scriptorium establishment to produce Bibles, single volume Bibles at Tours in the late 8th and early 9th century. By throwing a lot of manpower at it, the Tours scriptorium, David Gantz has shown, could turn out 3 single volume Turonian Bibles a year that were then disseminated to other scriptoria throughout the empire in Caroline minuscule, so that the regional styles and textual traditions of the mixed Old Latin Vulgate, the local styles of decoration, local styles of the early national hands could actually be part of a more uniform approach throughout a diverse empire. So not exactly an authorised King James Bible. Theodulf's translation, of course, is also very important, but we think that Alcuin had, of course, seen at least one of the Chalfith Bibles. He quotes some of the Sedulian poetry around the Ezra miniature, and it seems as if he did see one of the volumes, certainly, probably in Northumbria. And so I think the likelihood is that he did perpetuate the knowledge of the publishing system that we have with the Bibles. But of course, the other thing that it extends to is the, I should have said also, so that's that, just before I leave. The other thing on this hand is that 3 of the scribes give, not exactly colophons, they don't name themselves in Amiatinus, but they give a layout which is suggestive of colophons at the end of their texts. 2 of them give the usual oro pro, pray for the scribe. But this hand, which I've argued is the Beden hand, uses his little lightning flashes and the page layout to emphasise this word, labore. Now, time and time again in his autobiographical note and elsewhere, for Bede, it's the work, the Opus Dei. And so I would argue that for me, it's a fitting thing that Bede's colophon, if it is his hand, is the work, the dedication of the work. Now, the other thing, of course, that we can speak of in terms of publication, how much Bede was concerned with it himself, is the publication of his own text, which, of course, we're talking about posthumously, but which had begun during his own lifetime. These, of course, are the copies of the Historia Ecclesiastica, of which there are no less than 4 first-generation copies surviving, which, given the rate of survival of texts at this early period, is an incredibly high statistical sample. They must have been producing them in some number. So we have the St. Petersburg Bede seen here, and the Moor Bede, produced within probably 10 years of Bede's own death. The Moor Bede possibly as early as 737, Bede dying in 735. So not by Bede's hand, but as good an example of how Bede might have written his own works as his own copyist and secretary. And of course the use of the phase 2 insular minuscule in this way is interesting. There's a lot of Irish modelling to take into account this that would have been very influential, but also you've got the reference in the Cassiodorian Institutiones to one of his editions being written in Manu Manutiae, in the small script, okay, which of course gives a bit of an imprimatur to experiment with the use of minuscule for scripture, which in other script systems you do not use the same script for a Bible as you would for a shopping list or a letter. Okay, it's form and function related. But of course, the people who've been breaking that very successfully are the Irish. And I think the Beden approach to the deployment of minuscule is a very, very interesting one. And I think that may have something to do with the Corby Tour approach to then using the development of a stable Caroline for scripture. So that's another sort of strand of the influences through. Tiberius A14, probably dated to the 740s, using the sort of style of the stained glass at Jarrow. And of course another one, Tiberius C2, from early 9th century Canterbury, wearing a disc brooch of the sort that the well-dressed man about town would wear in Mercia at that time. And of course the Moor Bede is thought from the textual editions may well have been the copy that either Alcuin or Charlemagne owned at the end of the 8th century, which produces a stemma of transmission of the Historia Ecclesiastica on the continent. So basically just putting these together to give the idea that, you know, Weymouth Jarrow are actually creating and perpetuating and developing a line of transmission through Eusebius, Jerome, Vivarium, etc., of the role that you play in actually recovery of text, emendation, supplementation and creation of new text, and how you then disseminate that, and what the role of individual scribes in a Cenobitic collective scriptorium would be, and the role of the author potentially, if they have the aptitude and the desire, can play within that. So in terms of publishing and book history, this is a really, yeah, you know, the Irish and with a little bit of input from the Anglo-Saxons did save civilization. Certainly saved their libraries for a while there. So that's the line of inquiry that I've been producing with some of the work modelling from the actual manuscripts. Others of his work, this incredibly beautiful commentary on Proverbs, elegant books, in which writing them quickly doesn't mean writing them badly. The production values of some of these things are absolutely stunning. What was I going to say? Can I have 3 more minutes? Okay, I'm not going to tease this out too much here. You've all heard me, I'm sure, about Lindisfarne ad infinitum, but it does occur to me that there may be, I want to work a little bit more on what the relationship of Bede thought may have been within the creation process of the Lindisfarne Gospels. Now, we've got the situation where we think the St. Cuthbert Gospel is probably a gift from the Weymouth Jarrow community at some point to the shrine. Yeah, we've got the Neapolitan model or a Weymouth Jarrow copy of it for the text, the core text that Eadfrith or whoever worked on to create the Lindisfarne Gospels and supplemented with other things like canon tables from elsewhere, which comes from Weymouth Jarrow. So Weymouth Jarrow has either shared a very precious Neapolitan exemplar, which has gone on into library loan to Lindisfarne, or more likely they're creating copies of it, and that one of those copies is given to Lindisfarne. The relationship between Eadfrith and Bede is an interesting one. Eadfrith, of course, commissions him to write the prose life. You've had the anonymous life. Acker and his circle start attacking the anonymous life and saying Cuthbert wasn't really like that, he wasn't a good guy, etc., and this is bad scholarship. Bede writes a verse pop song version, but it's based on the anonymous. And so he's then opened himself to the same criticism from Acker and his circle. What does he do then? Eadfrith commissions him to sit down and write a proper prose version and to interview members of the Lindisfarne community and other of their sources. So that's when he goes to Lindisfarne. Okay. And from that, he works alongside Eadfrith, I would argue, to actually create a developed concept of the cult of Cuthbert and how also you might signify that visually to the pilgrim figures that are coming in there. So when we turn to the Lindisfarne Gospels, it interests me to see, is there anything Beden that we can see in that thought there? Now, I argued once with the physicality of the pigments, that when you get Eadfrith experimenting as an experimental chemist with the use of orchil, the lichen that grows around his feet on Cuddyzar, for example, that you can get 40 shades of purple from red to blue by varying the acidity and alkalinity. Stellurine gives you a nice rich ruby red, all gold substances, etc. Now, is that just aesthetic choice and experimentation, or is there the possibility of the fact that, Bede has just been writing on the temple and the tabernacle about the 40 shades of purple that the temple hangings are dyed, which represent the journey of the just soul? When he can't get lapis, but he fakes it using woad and suspending crystal gum and horn to replicate the recipe of lapis, the exoticism, etc., is important. This vision of a broader world in which the visual semiotics of your own people are intertwined with those of enemies and people you know not of near and far. This idea of creating, and I know I've taken a bashing from it, but an ironic vision of how signifiers, if we were going into a fusion restaurant tonight, an Irish, Lebanese, Italian fusion restaurant, the words on the menu would summon up whole cultural Serengetis for us in the same way as some of the use of these motifs and styles can. And I think they are deploying some of them strategically. And I pointed out that in Lindisfarne, a lot of the iconography, I would argue, is geared towards reconciliation of different traditions around 715, when Iona comes into orthodoxy, when Naples, again, and the Aquileian schism, which is reflected in the canon tables, is healed after several hundred years of schism. And it's around 715 that Aymon first showed. It's about that time that the first stational liturgies devised in Rome at the end of the 7th century start being replicated in liturgical manuscripts in Rome. And they're all simultaneously referencing in Lindisfarne, in the same way that when you look at something like this, you've got script systems, you've got Latin display capitals, you've got a very OM-looking version of the M there, okay, stylistic rather than an actual OM. You've got stylized runes and you've got Greek letter forms. So a visual signifier of 4 different script systems, 4 different languages, 4 different peoples, 4 different churchmanships from around the world coming together, in the same way that each of the 4 Gospels is indicated by a different cross. So Matthew is Latin, Mark is a ringhead, Luke is the Greek cross, and John is the Coptic and Ethiopic Tau crosses. Different traditions, different churchmanships. The whole thing keeps revolving around the fourfold harmony. Okay, the fourfold harmony of the Gospels, the elements, the humours, the languages, the peoples, etc. And this fourfold harmony, again, is something that Bede focuses on a number of occasions in his works. And then turning to the actual layout of the manuscript and the designs on the back, and the use of Pythagorean and Euclidean geometry and rabbinic numerological symbolism, etc. here. Now, all of these seem to play to me to some of the approach that Plato and Pliny used in their approach to aesthetics. Now, we've no evidence, obviously, of those texts being accessed, but Bede's studies of Pliny the Elder do actually bring forward some of those concepts. And for example, in part of the natural history, there's a section on art that Bede also comments on that says that art for Pliny wasn't primarily an aesthetic creative process. It was part of a process of establishing beauty through mathematics and the symbolism of the golden section, etc. And in establishing that beauty, you set up a vision of perfect harmony, which equals good. So that's the equation. You use your mathematics, your substructure, you create a perfect structure mathematically, which then becomes an aesthetic symbol of good and thought on high things, which has then a potentially ethical and moral outpouring. There's a lot of work to be done there still, but I don't know, it just kind of seems to me there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on, and it does seem to me that there's some potential, as far as we can go with our source material, of thinking about that collaboration. And the fact that, you know, it hasn't really been picked up, I don't think, enough adequately before, just how Bede lays himself on the line in those last couple of years of his life, when he knows that the emerging post-Wilfridian hierarchical structured approach to diocesan arrangements and politics is trying to actually get the more organic urban rural relationship of the Columban and the Cuthbertine approach off of the table, in the same way as Charlemagne would when he referred to Irish clergy as gyrophages. They're supra-territorial. They can't be controlled within a Roman military structure adapted for ecclesiastical use, and they want rid of it. And I think a lot of the arguing in the history of ecclesiastical representation of those aspects of Irish influence and are geared very much to showing that it's a mixed economy, and that is what works. And I think the aesthetics are something that would have been seen by the most pilgrims until the time of Becket in England. It's a big PR statement. And the way in which you use people's inner libraries, people who really, you know, aren't accessing these books any more than most of us do now, but are looking at them and accessing the symbolism of them, and also the intent of what goes into making them. And I think there's more to be thought about the relationship of some of these things and how the learning of Bede actually expresses itself visually.